Our favorite TV characters. Fired, gone, left for dead at the height of their careers. Something's just not right here. After all, these were the most beloved shows of their age, with a cast of incredible and relatable characters. But there seemed to be just one thing that all these shows had in common. An unassuming star, a fan favorite from day one, who vanished into thin air, or sometimes even worse, was replaced by a much crappier version.
See, that's why sitcoms are dying.
We would argue that this cast member should have even had more screen time, but hey, maybe that's why they were thrown off the ship. We've got tales of astronomical salaries, on-air scandals, secret feuds, scandalous affairs, and those that just didn't want to be in the limelight anymore. If you enjoyed today's case, be sure to give it a thumbs up for us, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a beat. These are the stories of those who left at the top. Joyce DeWitt. Janet and Jack were the only two characters to remain during the show's entire run. They were the constant we needed, but a new character, Vicky Bradford, was brought in for the final season to play Jack's love interest, and this shook things up. Janet was seemingly left behind, and the Jack and Janet romance many people thought was coming got sorely overlooked. Janet ended up marrying Philip Dawson in the final season, and they moved to another part of town after the honeymoon. And so, Jack and Victoria Bradford wound up together, and even got a new show together, Three's a Crowd. Unfortunately, the show was not as much of a crowd pleaser as its predecessor, and Three's a Crowd only lasted one season. Joyce DeWitt wasn't even invited to be part of the show. Ouch. Though DeWitt moved on and appeared in a few additional roles, but then took some time away from the spotlight to travel the world. She finally settled in New Mexico and only makes occasional appearances in stage shows. She still appears alongside some pretty big names, but mainly just enjoys the easy pace of life today. Roommate problems. Suzanne Somers. Chrissy Snow shined bright for the first 5 seasons, before money and ego pushed her from apartment 201. Bluntly, Somers left the show because she wanted to make the same salary as her male co-star John Ritter. After all, as Suzanne states in a 2009 interview, "I had the highest demographic of all women in television, 18 to 49. Heck, that seems fair, but the producers didn't think so. Her salary was around $30,000 an episode when she asked for a raise to $150,000 per. And to boot, she wanted 10% of the show's total profits, which is a lot. This caused a lot of problems during season 5, and she was written off the show because of it. The storyline took Chrissy home to take care of her ill mother, and she would periodically call Jack or Janet to talk on the phone.
Chrissy?
You're gonna have to yell a lot louder than that, Larry. She's away visiting her parents out of town.
These phone calls allowed Somers to still be in the show through the end of her contract. It's also interesting to note that a couple other main players in the female sitcom game had dire effects to Somers' lofty goals of equality, because what Suzanne and her husband and negotiator Alan Hamill didn't know at the time was that the ABC execs were now safeguarding every penny. They had just finalized a major deal with Penny Marshall and Cindy Williams.
Well, Vern, I wouldn't worry about it. Your turn will come.
Paying the two women more than they had hoped for to continue Laverne and Shirley. Suzanne Somers basically became the signal to all other women not named Penny and Cindy to keep quiet about raises and just hit their mark. And I'd say it definitely made an impression. After this struggle, John, Joyce, and Suzanne had a very tense relationship for years. During that pivotal 5th season, Suzanne would be forced to film her scenes separately from John and Joyce. They were tired from her antics as well. She would eventually speak to both of them again. Joyce DeWitt and Suzanne later reunited to talk about their time on Three's Company, and Somers also made up with John Ritter before he suddenly passed away in 2003. I guess all's well that ends well with Three's Company. Jenna Lee Harrison. After Somers exited the show, Harrison moved in to finish the 5th season and was a small part of the 6th. She played Cindy Snow, Chrissy's cousin, and the part was very similar to Chrissy's, expected to be the new ditzy blonde.
Bill, what's your birthday?
August 26th, why?
You're a Leo.
Virgo. Well, that's even better.
She was also pretty clumsy. Do you remember her bumping into things all the time? It was implied in the storyline that Cindy Snow moved out to attend college at UCLA, and the character never contacted the roommates again. Typical college forgetfulness. Priscilla Barnes. Season 6 saw the addition of Terry Alden to the cast, played by actress Priscilla Barnes. Barnes had originally auditioned for the role of Cindy Snow, but got turned down. And her new role, Terry Alden, was a registered nurse, finally bringing some intelligence into apartment 201.
Arguing with your pens down.
I don't have my...
Thank you.
And would be the final roommate of the trio. At the conclusion of the show, Terry moves to Hawaii to continue her nursing career. And one quite interesting tidbit, the show She's the Sheriff was Suzanne Somers' next TV job, but that project originally had Priscilla Barnes set to star as the sheriff. But Suzanne Somers replaced her shortly before production began, because ironically, Barnes had jumped ship to replace Suzanne in Three's Company. Oh, the sitcom shuffle. The trouble with landlords. Norman Fell. Stanley Roper was the old-fashioned landlord, which really helped the show take off. Roper had a great reputation for bickering with his wife Helen, brilliantly played by Audra Lindley. They respected each other, but sometimes it was hard to see. One of his signature phrases was, "Not tonight, Helen, I got a headache." And then Helen would make some snide remark about Roper's lack of sexual drive of any kind. And seriously, the chemistry between these two was astounding. And Fell was also dynamic for breaking the fourth wall and smiling directly at the audience and camera.
I'll be strictly platonic.
Well, I don't care what it is. What does that mean?
But why did Fell leave the show? Well, because the producers convinced him to star in their spin-off, titled The Ropers. Starring Stanley and Helen Roper, this show has legs, right? Well, they moved to California and lived next door to a real estate agent. And this series was also based on a British show called George and Mildred. But the producers really had to convince him to join the Ropers, and only did so with the promise of coming back to Three's Company if the show tanked after just one season. But it didn't tank after one season, it debuted with relatively high numbers. Then it got shuffled to a new time slot and things went downhill. The Ropers was canceled 14 months later. But get this, the producers wouldn't let Norman Fell come back because the contract stipulated the one-season plateau that it met. The devil truly was in the details for this one. And it was also a tough decision with the new landlord in town. A comedic genius and one of the only men who could match John Ritter in beautiful silliness. Don Knotts. The new landlord was Mr. Ralph Furley, and somehow he was even more out there than Stanley. He played an older ladies' man, and classically the ladies did not love him.
No, thank you.
Well, how about some other night?
Thanks, but I doubt that I'll ever be that hungry.
Mr. Furley's outfits always shone bright, with wacky, bright colors and awesome patterns. Several of Mr. Furley's mannerisms are comparable to his Barney Fife from The Andy Griffith Show, the role that Don is most known for. So we gotta know, who was the better landlord in your opinion? Mr. Roper or Mr. Furley? Did Alan Alda and Gary Burghoff get along?
If they can't depend on you, maybe there's no point in depending on anything.
Look, you can't lay all that on my shoulders.
You absolutely want to think that the actors behind your favorite characters get along great off-screen, especially when they're playing brothers in arms. So, how did the residential Hawkeye and the Radar get along? Because that sounds like a match made in heaven. Well, at the time, there were some pretty harsh words going around about Gary. Probably best summarized by a 1983 TV Guide article that said people loved Radar but hated Gary. The article says that he saw conspiracies against him everywhere and he could dish it out but threw a fit when someone gave it back. And things were especially hard with Alan Alda, so says the article anyway. But what do the actors have to say? Just last spring, Alan shared a birthday tribute on Twitter dedicated to Radar and even shared a funny story. Gary's supposed archenemy told him, quote, "Happy birthday, Gary. You gave me the longest laughing jag I ever had in the scene where you had to drop your pants and couldn't stop laughing. Hope you laughed again today." So what's that about anyway? Well, the biggest pants-related blooper that comes to mind dates way back to the original film. in the scene where Colonel Potter asks Radar to help him take his pants off. Turns out help was definitely needed because in an outtake, those pants refused to come down. When Gary finally made progress, a leg still stayed in place and he had to give the crew a pleading look for help. So I think Alda saw this outtake, or maybe I'm missing another pants-related mishap. So please get in the comments and tell me if I am. Also making him sound a bit less nightmarish was a glowing review by co-star Jamie Farr. He said, quote, "Gary Burghoff was an absolute delight. He brought that little charm to Radar. He brought a little something special to the show that none of the other characters had." Did Radar really play the drums? It sure sounds like on top of his sonar hearing, Radar could drum out a pretty great beat. In an age where TV musicians fake it as needed, that solo was very much real. For a regular on a war comedy drama, Gary Burghoff had a surprisingly musical background. Some of his earliest studies were in tap dancing, but his ear for rhythm doesn't end there, and it took him to a pretty surprising place. Did you know the early Peanuts comic strips got their own musical? It is called You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, and it began as an off-Broadway musical in 1967. The actor who played everyone's favorite blockhead, Gary Burghoff, meaning he premiered the character on stage. And a quick side note, that musical is really fantastic, see it if you can. But wait, there are more crazy crossovers. Gary landed himself a spot drumming for a band called The Relatives. The band would open in a Vegas casino, and their lead singer was something special. Yes, that is a young Linda Carter, wondrous enough. It doesn't get more hardcore than playing drums with a singing Amazonian warrior princess. This shared musical history also saw them become good friends, and Gary later appeared in a New Adventures of Wonder Woman episode called The Man Who Wouldn't Tell. Why was Gary Burghoff written off MASH? Gary was in the 1970 Robert Altman film, and when switching to the small screen, all the other main actors were swapped out entirely or switched roles, except for Gary. Gary was excited to keep playing Radar and flesh him out more than a worldly schemer, saying, quote, "I wanted that character to be more than just a nickname," and he transformed Radar from a nickname to a fan favorite for years. So why in the heck did such a beloved fan favorite leave? We said goodbye, farewell, and amen to him in the 1979 episode Goodbye Radar. It was heartbreaking for fans, but a much-needed break for Gary, who got a serious case of burnout. The guy gave 200% to the job, and pouring that much into it left him exhausted and contributed to his first marriage ending. Working that much left no time for the little things in life, like friends, faith, family, and music. He especially missed everything from his life in Connecticut and Wisconsin. Thankfully, things didn't end on a sour note between actor and studio, and the executives made it known that they would have welcomed him back at the drop of a hat.
Like it?
Oh, yes, it's really swell.
How much did Gary Burghoff make on MASH? Gary's tenure with MASH meant he developed some pretty deep pockets. After all, he was a very popular fixture on the show, so they were willing to fork over some extra cash for him. And that was needed when Gary had to step away to repair his family life. Radar proved an irreplaceable presence on the show, and executives actually approached him to make a deal, offering him a whopping $4 million contract. For context, that's equal to about $15 million today. For even more context, that was a huge deal in 1979. Larry Hagman got $2.4 million as J.R. Ewing on Dallas. America's Pa, Michael Landon, got $3.8 for Little House. Then we get to Radar, and then Carol O'Connor with $4.8 as Archie Bunker. But wait, there's another MASH member on this list. Oh gosh, Alan Alda was the highest paid actor, earning $5.4 million. But Gary would have ranked up there with the best of the best. Would have, of course, if he didn't turn down this tantalizing offer to focus on family, which included an 8-year marriage that ended in divorce, along with raising a daughter. And Gary did all right, of course. He made income other ways, like with some oddly specific inventions that include fish bait called chum magic and a handle to lift toilet seats. He's also a postage history aficionado and has been consulted for securing desirable US stamps with other collectors. Seriously, Gary Burghoff, quite the Renaissance man. What is Radar from MASH doing now? Gary was always attuned to nature's beauty, part of why he was chafing under constant work that kept him from appreciating life's beauties. So missing that so much got him into outdoorsy and artsy hobbies like fishing and painting wildlife. His favorite medium is oil paintings, and his first art piece is called Eye to Eye, inspired by seeing a red fox as a child. On top of that, he's also fully qualified to handle injured wildlife. Protecting nature is a cause he is very passionate about. And as he focuses more on enriching parts of his life, he also got married again in 1985. And this union lasted until 2005 and resulted in 2 sons. As for acting, there were a few entries throughout the 1980s, some appearances on The Love Boat and landing on Fantasy Island. After getting some air, he returned to MASH with the program After MASH.
Oh boy, jackpot.
And a pilot of what would have been his own series called Walter, all caps and stylized like MASH. Then another dry spell until 2010's Daniel's Lot. Beyond that, Gary has comfortably retired his teddy bear and enjoyed the rewards of making such a memorable character like Radar. Was there a real Nellie Oleson? Little House on the Prairie changed the landscape of television and delved into some very mature, glossed-over themes. You might not have caught them all, like addiction, poverty, faith, prejudice, and even assault. It tackled real topics and had very real roots. And of course, some of you have read the books that started it all. The Little House series by the real Laura Ingalls Wilder. The books beautifully paved the way for this 9-season television titan, but it wasn't a one-to-one adaptation. Michael Landon compared the novels to cookbooks, so a lot of drama had to be added. Nellie Oleson appeared in 3 Little House books, but it was enough to give the show's writers something to work with. And while plenty of characters existed in real life, Nellie was not one of them. Instead, she's more of a mashup of 3 different people in Laura's life: Nellie Owens, Estella Gilbert, and Genevieve Masters. Nellie Owens made such a negative impression on Ingalls Wilder that she didn't dare use the same name in her books. Yup, that's some deep-seated fear from childhood. Did Alison Arngrim wear a wig on Little House?
I won't take it back because it's true.
What's it like to be one of the most hated characters in fiction? Was it a role with a reception Alison thought was worth keeping? Well, it came with quite a few ups and downs. First, the costuming. The head of curly golden locks was indeed a wig. As Alison puts it, quote, "There was no point at which it felt comfortable. The stylist had to pin parts of the curly wigs to her head, but, warning if you just ate, they would pin them so tight that Alison's scalp would bleed on multiple occasions. Ouch. Then there's the top layers of clothing that all the women had to wear, making for a very uncomfortable experience. Which maybe made her job easy, I guess. Early on in the audition process, Alison knew this girl was a piece of work. In fact, when she was asked to read for Nellie, she told her dad, quote, "This is not a normal part. This girl is, well, she's the B word." Her father told her to just read the material with that in mind, and looking back, Alison thinks it says something about her that she did so well to earn the part. That playing Nellie confirmed her suspicions, and she described it as, quote, "like having PMS for 7 years." She did her job so well, but any actor who plays a baddie inevitably gets a lot of haters, and boy did she get haters. In fact, one viewer despised Nellie so much, they physically confronted Alison when she was only 16, while at the Hollywood Christmas parade. That's not in the spirit. Suddenly, an onlooker rushed forward and threw a cup of orange soda right at her head. Wow, playing Nasty Nellie really could be a thankless job. Are Melissa Gilbert and Alison Arngrim still friends?
Laura smells like a dirty horse. Laura smells...
Tom and Jerry, Al Bundy and Neighbor Marcy, Half Pint and Nasty Nellie. TV is chock full of iconic rivalries, and Alison and Melissa were primed to be enemies from the start. That's because Alison actually auditioned for 2 other roles, neither of them Nellie. Her top pick was Laura Ingalls, but series lead and co-creator Michael Landon saw her better suited as the primary antagonist, basically boxing her out of any chance for that leading lady praise the others got. Alison channeled some of Nellie's spirit on set. Remember when all the younger characters grew into having love interests? Melissa Gilbert and Dean Butler didn't quite have the chemistry showrunners wanted to see and pointed to Alison and Steve Tracy as a primary example. Gilbert was squeamish around PDA, and armed with this knowledge, Alison made it her mission to make romantic scenes with Steve as gushy, over the top, and all around uncomfortable as possible, just to tease Gilbert. But here's the twist. Alison and Melissa were actually great friends. There was zero animosity between the actors, not for Gilbert getting the role that Alison wanted, not for competing screen time, nothing. Looking back, Alison said, quote, "It's funny, I think if you play enemies on set, you end up becoming friends. We hit it off right away. We had slumber parties, visit each other's houses on weekends. People couldn't believe it. And as recently as 2021, Melissa went onto social media and called Alison, quote, one of my very dearest friends and very favorite on-screen partners. But wait, there's another twist. If Alison was friends with her on-screen enemy, how close was she with others? And as that turns out, where the real tension came from is where you'd least expect it. America's Pa, Michael Landon. And we also have an entire video dedicated to Landon's short and troubled life if you want to watch that one next. But for now, just know that Alison has called Landon a bundle of contradictions, very capable of being a fun-loving uncle figure and an absolute terror to all around him. Landon drank a lot, even right on set. Alison saw Landon drinking away in the back of a prop truck and saw a staff member pour 4 fingers of wild turkey bourbon into his coffee. She later had the nasty realization that Landon could clear 2 cases of Coors beer per day. Alison did say nobody ever looked tipsy on set, but that Landon could get volatile. One time, Alison broke her arm in a skateboarding accident. She ended up in a cast, and since it interfered with filming, Landon set the ultimatum: no more skating. He also signed the cast in big letters in a place impossible to miss, so she didn't forget while recovering. Alison saw enough of Landon's unsavory side that when Karen Grassley, the mom, released a memoir spilling all the beans about Pa, she backed all the claims. Alison called him, quote, more mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Why did Nasty Nellie leave Little House on the Prairie? For all the challenges playing Nasty Nellie gave Alison, it was pretty great too. She gained a lifelong friend with Melissa Gilbert, and on top of that, Nellie let Alison vent out some of her deep-seated frustrations. You see, as a child, she had been sexually abused. One particular Little House scene had her screaming and raising her fists. Alison looked back and realized, quote, yep, I was very relaxed after that day. Nellie was also full of some pleasant surprises for Alison. She became the subject of a pretty interesting character arc, transforming her bratty personality into something more mature and likable. And there was the problem. Alison called Nellie bland and boring after she reformed, and the writers couldn't think of anything else to do with the character. That meant Alison too had nothing to do, and in her memoir, she admitted feeling a total lack of excitement. The idea of doing that into her 30s left Alison sick to her stomach. So the paycheck had to be big enough, or so she hoped, but NBC did not budge. The network refused every bit of negotiation. Their terms, 4 years, same pay and conditions, take it or leave it. Losing a job is shattering enough, but for Alison, the blow stung especially hard, because she was very loyal to this show. Her agent and dad were outraged on her behalf, but the final choice was hers. Alison Arngrim walked away from Little House. There was no grand goodbye, leaving Alison feeling a bit unfulfilled, but leave it to Melissa Gilbert to make her feel special. Alison reached out to her, and Gilbert already knew. She was a rock and got her an unusual gift. Gilbert gave Alison a necklace with a crying baby charm, saying that it reminded her of Alison, and the gift was wrapped in a jobs listing from the local paper. Gilbert added, quote, you probably will need these now. Touche, half pint. What does Alison Arngrim do now? Even though Alison was the face of a bratty mean girl, she had no trouble landing future work. Her Little House heritage is one she can celebrate, despite the rough ending. And you have to read her memoir called Confessions of a Prairie. Great title, Alison, but it's the nostalgic crossover of the century in the web series, Life Interrupted. There you can see Alison playing the life partner of another Do You Remember favorite, little Erin Murphy from Bewitched. The two actors had a blast working together, and it's given Alison's husband plenty of material to tease her with, jokingly bonding with Erin over having both married Alison. But Nellie's biggest joy is her advocacy work. In between jobs, Alison really felt the depression from her childhood abuse. After a lot of therapy, she dedicated herself to helping others. She has served as president of the National Association to Protect Children. She had a lot of influence, speaking to the California State Senate, campaigning in multiple states, and influencing federal legislation. When her on-screen partner, Steve Tracy, came forward with his HIV diagnosis, she signed up for the AIDS Project Los Angeles Hotline training program. She read up on all the facts and myths, and used her fame and platform to teach others. Now she can look back and happily say, quote, "I get recognized more now than I did when the show was running. There was a time in my 20s when I would say I didn't want to be recognized as Nellie forever, but Nellie was a lot of fun to play. Indeed, I thought I'd be sick of it, but now it just makes me smile." Crafting a character. The Rockford Files is used to being on top, a lot more than its main character. This series has a long stay on top 100, top 50, and even top 10 greatest show lists. And the reasons usually point to critical writing and a strong cast with great chemistry. But the core of what made the Rockford Files so beloved was its refreshing break from genre conventions. No one would compare Jim Rockford to James Bond, except to point out how different the two are.
Alone at last.
One's a suave ladies' man, and the other is hapless, usually broke, and sometimes doesn't even hurt the bad guy he's fighting, or simply hurts himself. And casting this lovable everyman was no problem. Co-creator Huggins knew Garner from his iconic Maverick, and it was the spirit of Maverick that inspired Huggins to reshape it into Rockford. It gave him the perfect setup to keep the same formula. Brett Maverick was a break from the strong, danger-loving cowboy. Maverick was unusually wholesome, instead of morally gray, and the guy was in no rush to get hurt. Sound familiar? Huggins decided to take Maverick from the 1800s to present day, this time breaking the private eye norms. Jim Rockford didn't carry a gun permit or a gun. Instead, it lived in a cookie jar covered in coffee beans. Shootouts were too violent for the story they wanted to tell, so we got car chases instead, further ingraining this different but exciting series. Originally, this bumbling character was intended to be utilized in the dramatic crime series Toma, which Huggins wrote 13 episodes for, but the networks read the script and said, "Wait, this is way too funny," and instructed him to remove the humor. The rewritten script was used for the pilot of Toma, but the Rockford energy was still too jarringly funny for NBC. Garner was a no-brainer match for Rockford. I mean, it's kind of his birthright. His full name is James Scott Garner, and this iconic character was named James Scott Rockford. First impressions. The Rockford Files had Jim not answering the phone before it was cool, and it created one of the most quoted answering machines ever. There were 122 unique answering machine messages across 6 seasons. It's understandable then that sometimes that creativity dried up, so the writers would ask for ideas from anyone on payroll. They were all meant to have a comedic or absurd feeling, and sometimes reference past events.
It's Andra, remember last summer at Pat's? I've got a 12-hour layover before I go to Chicago. How about it?
Then came the theme song. High energy and thrills, just like the show. You could never accuse Rockford Files of cutting corners. They recruited some of the biggest names in the industry. For several episodes, the writing team contained David Chase, the brain behind The Sopranos. And same goes for music. Mike Post is the composer behind Magnum P.I., L.A. Law, and Law & Order. And his colleague, Pete Carpenter, composed some of our favorite nostalgic tunes for The Andy Griffith Show and Gomer Pyle, and Oh My Stars, Bewitched. So it's no surprise that the Rockford tune became a hit. It peaked at number 10 on the Billboard Hot 100. Any soccer fans here? Or should I say football? Well, the Tranmere Rovers from Britain are big fans of Rockford, and the squad sometimes runs onto the field with the theme song blaring. If these bops have you wanting to call up Rockford with a new case, well, you can, sort of. He has a phone number, of course. It's 311-555-2368. But something's wrong here. As far back as the 50s, phone companies set 555 aside. That's why just about every piece of media uses a phone number with 555.
555.
555.
555.
The biggest exception being 867-5309. But dial that number and who you gonna call? Ghostbusters, of course, since they had that phone number too.
We're ready to believe you.
Putting his whole heart and knees into it. James Garner was no stranger to action and dangerous fights, and the actor insisted on doing his own stunts, especially fist fights and car chases. That's wonderful dedication, but it came at a cost. His knees were pummeled over and over, and Garner even suffered from ulcers, not to mention severe back pain, which could be crippling, as he kept taking a beating as the series went on. Well, his doctors told Garner to take it easy, and by season 6, he had to bow out from the sheer agony his body was in. Call in the stunt double, Sharp Getaway. One running gag was that Rockford could never remember license plate numbers correctly, which is kind of a big deal when tracking down a perp, but Garner could never forget his character's plate, as it was tied to his own life. His agent had the idea of 853 OKG. The numbers are actually a date, August 1953, the day Garner first began acting, and OKG stands for his home state of Oklahoma and his last name. And that rested on the back of Rockford's famous Copper Mist Pontiac Firebird Esprit. A new year meant a new car model, always in that same hue. And of course, they had to be able to perform that patented J-turn, Rockford's favorite evasive maneuver, even though it was usually to get him out of a sticky situation. Driven, pun intended, by fear. The same maneuver is even taught to Secret Service agents. Financial fame and folly. Just as powerful as its main cast was, Rockford's slew of supporting characters and guest stars was impressive too. In the past, Universal paid Garner $25,000 per episode, and it also hosted many big names in the industry, like Bill Mumy of Lost in Space fame, Abe Vigoda from Barney Miller, the Bionic Woman herself Lindsay Wagner, and even Tom Selleck.
See, Jim? Things are working out.
Later on, Magnum characters would even reference this episode of Rockford Files. All these big names shone bright under the balmy, clear skies of scenic Malibu, Los Angeles. The Rockford Files spared no expense, recruiting the best and filming on location with authenticity whenever possible. Jim's trailer was filmed right along the Pacific Coast Highway. In fact, head on over to 29 Cove Road if you want to go on a Rockford pilgrimage. A lot of the stunts were practical too, like when Jim's gorgeous car was actually damaged, and that meant needing repairs or even replacements. Garner once said producers paid $700 once for a wooden crate, just to break it in a shipyard that was already full of wooden crates. This dedication had a hefty price tag. Some inside sources say the show lost money into the millions. So when the series lost its leading man, NBC decided to pull the plug as well, just halfway through the season. Yikes. Rockford Reborn. By the time Garner was done with the Rockford Files the first round anyway, he was nominated for an Emmy 5 straight years, winning the lead actor in 1977. But that didn't mean everything was rosy when the camera stopped. Like any great series, Rockford Files got a lot of exposure when it went to syndication, and of course more profit potential too. Universal had hope for Rockford, and thought promoting it would spark enough interest that it could start up again. Problem was, Garner didn't think he was getting paid enough, and this was a problem for a while. His response? Sue Universal for $2.2 million, or 37.5% of the net profits. The ensuing battle lasted years, and finally Universal settled with the actor outside of court. No one knows the exact terms, but thankfully it was enough to broker some peace. So much so that we got to see Garner in that gorgeous Pontiac Firebird once again. Return of Rockford. When the dust settled from the contract disputes, actor and studio agreed to 8 TV movies, this time on CBS. For the most part, it was the cast reunion we always hoped for, except sadly Noah Beery died in 1994. So the first in the series had a nice dedication to his memory, saying, quote, "We love you and miss you, Pidge." Of course, referencing Noah's nickname. The films released from 1994 to 99 took place 15 years after the show's unexpected mid-season ending. They stayed true to the charm of the original, but didn't quite have the same energy, which was pretty deliberate too, since the whole passage of time was felt. For one thing, spoiler, Rocky dies, delivering a sobering reminder of the importance of life. They also leaned into Garner's own aging and physical limitations. Injuries caused him to step down the first time, and aging is practically a plot point in the movies. It just doesn't go away after all. And everyone loves callbacks, which worked great for the films. Old contacts could reappear and ask for help, and of course Rockford obliged. But this time we could see and even hear the toll it took on him. It was also the show's chance to tie up some loose ends. Viewers finally got some closure, but what do you think? Did it work? Was this the ending you always wanted for the team? Get in the comments and you let us know your thoughts. The Rockford Files was the quintessential crime series, a tradition that can keep on through the generations. I mean, the character was so finely crafted, and it's a testament to the series that it weathered drama that would have decimated other programs. And when it came back, it knew we wanted some closure, and it delivered. The beginnings of Dick York. Richard Allen York was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana in 1928 to Bernard and Betty York. He grew up in the height of the Great Depression, and along with many others, York knew what it was like to be poor, and in turn made it his mission to help those who were less fortunate. But we'll get to that soon. As a teenager, York was living in Chicago and got an early start in acting. At just 15 years old, a Catholic nun recognized his strong voice potential, and he landed a starring gig on the CBS radio show That Brewster Boy. He worked in various radio shows and commercials for the next few years. And the other network, ABC, had an eye on York too. Even the Navy hired Dick to act in their recruiting videos that were shown in high schools across the US.
One was eating buns. Hell, I can't help him. It's a doc's job.
And after this early success, Dick York moved to New York City and began getting his feet wet on Broadway in the 1950s. Some notable shows were Tea and Sympathy and Bus Stop. He began to get screen work in 1953, acting with Adam West in an episode of the Philco Television Hour. And by 55, he was getting major film roles. First, co-starring with Janet Leigh and Jack Lemmon in the musical My Sister Eileen. And York followed Jack Lemmon to Operation Madball in 1957, which was actually the screen debut of Mary Tyler Moore. On the call sheet, she's listed as Mary Moore. In 1958, one more time with Jack Lemmon in the dark, realistic Western Cowboy, where Lemmon nearly died during the Longhorns cattle stampede sequence. The crew were all scared to death as a stuntman had not been hired. Realism indeed. And this near injury precurses our next chapter of Dick York's life, as his on-set injury would not be amiss. The injury. In 1959, Dick York was in the movie They Came to Cordura, with a starring role alongside Gary Cooper and Rita Hayworth.
I really was scared in that fight. That's why I bit my chin strap through.
But in the final scenes of the film, while using a hand-operated railroad car, one of the extras on the car grabbed onto the handle opposite of Dick York, and the unexpected motion caused the muscles in the right side of Dick's back to tear completely, causing extreme pain and a debilitating spinal injury that would alter the rest of his life and career. There was no cure for his injury, and the amount of painkillers he took was steadily increasing. York said the following about the incident, quote, "The muscles along the right side of my back tore. They just snapped and let loose. And that was the start of it all. The pain, the painkillers, the addiction, the lost career." He'd complete his final film role in 1960 in the Spencer Tracy courtroom drama Inherit the Wind. He played the part of teacher Bertram Cates, which was based on the real incident of the Scopes monkey trial that took place in 1925. And this is a phenomenal picture if you've not seen it.
And with drums beating, we'll be marching backward. Backward!
And was actually the very first in-flight movie ever shown on Trans World Airlines. But film work is very labor-intensive, so Dick York decided to stick to television. Work despite pain. Dick York took pain medication to alleviate the stress, and kept right on working. He guest starred on some of the best TV shows of the 50s and early 60s, highlighted by 2 episodes of The Twilight Zone and 6 appearances on Alfred Hitchcock Presents. In 1962, Dick co-starred with Gene Kelly in the short-lived spin-off series Going My Way, based on the Bing Crosby film. But it did not catch on, and it would be Gene Kelly's final weekly television attempt. York, however, was not done yet. Bewitched. Bewitched began in 1964, and although Samantha promised she'd not do magic around Darren, that never played out, and we often saw Darren transformed in one way or another, much to his dismay.
Darren, what are you doing? You said that—
Don't try to stop me, Sam. She's been asking for this for a long time.
They had a whimsical marriage, to say the least, and audiences and critics loved York's Darren Stevens. He was even nominated for an Emmy Award in 1968, but he lost out to Don Adams from Get Smart. Now, Dick York loved working on this show, but that's if he could bring himself to set. His back injury had flared up again, and in a bad way. He couldn't stand for long periods of time. A slanted wall was built for him to lean against between shots. During season 3, the filming of the show was slowed down to attempt to accommodate York. More and more scenes were tweaked to where York was now sitting or lying down, but his part was being cut from scenes so that production could go on. And during season 5 of the show, York experienced a medical emergency, was taken to the hospital, and spent some time recovering. A producer of Bewitched visited him and asked if he was ready to quit working on the show. Dick York replied, "If it's all right with you." He never came back to that Burbank set, and production quietly replaced him with another actor, Dick Sargent. Unfortunately, the new Dick didn't have the same charm, and the ratings began to decline fast. Addiction. York was worn out from this back pain, and even before he left Bewitched, he was addicted to the opiate painkiller so necessary for a day's work. It got so bad he would be absent from filming because he was too high on his meds. But finally, York decided to quit taking the drugs and went through terrible withdrawal symptoms. But thankfully, he had quit the painkillers for good. York the Landlord. Eventually, he and his wife, who was his childhood sweetheart named Joan Alt, with whom he had 5 children and remained with until his ultimate passing. Well, the two bought an apartment building together, and York turned into a kind landlord who didn't even evict tenants when they didn't pay rent. But this generosity caused the Yorks to fall behind on payments, and the bank wasn't so generous, forced to foreclose on the property. The Yorks were allowed to stay in their apartment, but had to clean the other units for the bank foreclosure. It's definitely not what Stanley Roper would have done, but hey, sometimes people just can't pay. And Dick York was a kind soul with declining health. After their building was foreclosed, the Yorks were very poor. They didn't have money to visit the dentist, and his teeth were now rotting. Not to mention, he had put on a lot of weight and now couldn't find steady work. But he did make one final return. A return to TV. In the early 80s, he lost some weight and began to look like himself again. And this charming actor appeared on single episodes of Simon & Simon in 1983 and Fantasy Island the following year. His final acting credit was in the TV movie High School USA, but acting as a whole was not done with Dick York quite yet. Acting for life. Known for his compassionate nature, Dick York founded the charity Acting for Life to help those in need. Specifically, he helped people find a way out of homelessness. He knew what it was like to have nothing and struggle for food. And York knows that everyone's one step away from homelessness, whether they realize it or not. York truly had a heart of gold. And in his final years, while oftentimes bedridden, he spent much of his time on the phones with businessmen, politicians, and others, crowdsourcing money and supplies for his charity. Sadly, Dick York was a smoker for much of his life. It was not unusual for him to go through 3 packs a day. This led to a battle with emphysema, and by 1989, he was mostly seen wearing an oxygen tank to help him breathe. And Dick York passed away from those breathing complications on February 2nd, 1992. He was only 63 years old. But York once stated about his life, quote, "I've been blessed. I have no complaints. I've been surrounded by people in radio, on stage, and in motion pictures and television who love me. The things that have gone wrong have been simply physical things. I mean, that's pretty profound. From a star actor who had an on-set extra derail his entire career trajectory, Dick York could have easily put blames on others, but he did not. So let's toast to the original Darren, the great Dick York." There they are, actors who helped make their shows infamous, but for one reason or another did not get to finish that race. So, who that we mentioned was your favorite? Which show was your favorite? And did we miss any incredible breakout star that for some reason didn't get to finish the show? Well, please get in the comments and tell us all your thoughts. After all, we are nothing without you. If you enjoyed our compilation, please give this video a thumbs up to show your support. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a memory. But most importantly, from all of us here at Do You Remember, we want to thank you very much for watching.